I had thought my day couldn't possibly get worse, but I was dead wrong. The entire week at work had been a nightmare, culminating in my boss, the company president, calling me into his office to reprimand me for a mistake that wasn't even mine. It felt like a punch to the gut. When I finally got home, I was greeted by another headache. My sister-in-law Susan's car was blocking my driveway, preventing me from parking in front of my house. To make matters worse, the neighbor's teenage son had lined the street with his friends' cars, forcing me to park 3 doors down. As I walked toward the house, I couldn't help but question why I even bothered. My relationship with Susan had always been off since the day we met. She seemed to harbor an inexplicable dislike for me. I also felt a knot of frustration in my stomach because I had little hope for an intimate evening with my wife, Janice. We hadn't been close in nearly a month, despite my persistent efforts to rekindle the spark. Approaching my driveway, I noticed an empty garbage can by the curb. I dragged it around to the side of the house and placed it next to the back door. As I entered the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of music and the chatter of my wife and her sister in the living room. Grabbing a beer from the refrigerator, I took a deep breath and headed toward the living room, but froze when I overheard a sentence that sent chills down my spine. God, he ducked me 3 times today. It was my wife, Janice, speaking. My heart sank further when I realized she was talking about Brandon, her ex-boyfriend who had recently returned to town. Ever since Brandon came back last month, I just can't get enough of him, Janice confessed. My mind raced. Curiously, Susan asked, "So what are you going to do now?" Janice replied, "Brandon wants me to move in with him. I'll get a lawyer and file for divorce. This is a community property state, so I'll get half of everything." That was it. I had heard more than enough. Numbly, I retraced my steps to the back door and headed back to my car. Slumping into the driver's seat, it hit me hard. My wife was sharing herself with someone else and now wanted half of everything I had worked so hard for. The worst part was knowing that the state would likely grant it to her. Janice and I had tied the knot just 3 years ago. She had quit her job right after our wedding, and during her time at home, she never lifted a finger around the house. I had hired a maid 3 times a week to handle cleaning and laundry, and on those days, she would cook dinner. The rest of the time, it was either takeout or me cooking. I could hear the judgments echoing in my head. But love had blinded me. Janice had kept me happy, at least until a month ago. I'd lost my mother when I was 13, a devastating blow for both my father and me. Dad had done his best to raise me right, and we grew incredibly close. Losing him to a drunk driver when I was 23 hit me like a freight train, just a year before I met Janice. Inheriting nearly $25 million from Dad, I had made smart investments with the help of a reliable broker. Despite Janice's attempts to spend every dime I earned, I had hundreds of thousands in savings untouched. I had chosen not to dip into my inheritance, allowing it to grow, even in this unstable economy. I could live comfortably without ever having to touch that money. My love for Janice led us to skip the prenuptial agreement, a classic mistake many couples make, thinking their marriage would last forever. Now, I was staring down the barrel of a potential divorce that could cost me almost $1.5 million, all because of her infidelity. The state seemed all too eager to support this legalized form of exploitation. Janice had mentioned getting a lawyer, which meant she wasn't ready to serve me papers yet. I realized I had some time to act. Formulating a plan in my mind, I took a deep breath, knowing I had to prepare for the battle ahead. This was just the beginning. I sat in my car, watching the rearview mirror until my sister-in-law's vehicle pulled out and drove away. Once I was sure she was gone, I started the engine, made a U-turn, and headed back to my driveway. As I stepped inside the house, I noticed Janice was nowhere to be found, so I made my way to the kitchen for another beer. I popped the top and took a long swig, contemplating my next steps. "Oh, there you are, honey," Janice greeted me as she entered the kitchen. "I didn't hear you come in." "Hello, dear. I just got in." "It's been a long day," I replied, forcing a loving smile, determined to play the part just as convincingly as she did. "I didn't have time to order anything for dinner," she said, pouting slightly. I wanted to say that was because she spent her day with her boyfriend, sharing every detail with her sister, but instead I replied, "That's okay, sweetie. I'll just heat up some leftovers from last night." She gave me a sweet smile, kissed my cheek, and announced she was going to take a long, hot bath. Smiling and nodding, I thought, yeah, you've got to wash all that away. Once she left, I grabbed a plate of cold fried rice and downed it with 2 more beers. After tossing the empty container, I retreated to the den, sinking into the chair and flipping through channels. I settled on an old movie, but my mind was elsewhere, plotting my next move. When Janice returned about half an hour later, she settled on the couch until the movie ended. She stood up, claiming she was tired and heading to bed. "Yeah, tired from being unfaithful," I muttered under my breath. I told her I'd watch the news and join her later, though I hadn't really paid attention to the movie. The next few days dragged on. I kept busy with yard work on Saturday and played golf with the guys on Sunday. By Monday, I was ready to act. I called my broker, who was handling my inheritance portfolio, and had everything liquidated. Being in upper management allowed me to cash in my 401k quickly, penalty be damned. By Thursday, I was set to make my move. I returned home to my supposedly loving wife, informing her of an emergency situation that required me to fly out for a week on company business. I packed 2 suitcases, just the essentials. When we moved into this house, I had stored everything meaningful to me. None of it fit with her taste, so I felt no attachment to any of it. The furnishings were all her choices, and honestly, I couldn't have cared less. The silver lining was that we were renting the place, so I had no financial investment tied up in it. We had recently sold my condo and were in the process of finding the right house, one that met her standards. So far, nothing we'd looked at seemed to fit her criteria. On Friday morning, I kissed my wife on the cheek one last time and loaded my suitcases into my Lexus. I drove away without a single backward glance. My first stop was at my buddy Jake's place. I trusted him implicitly, and he was astonished when I proposed trading my car for his older, rebuilt 4-wheel drive. I confided in him about my situation, and an hour later, I was headed west in the new vehicle. I doubted anyone would connect me to my old car, and Jake promised to keep it hidden in his garage for a while. For the next 4 days, I paid for everything in cash. I had canceled all our credit cards to avoid leaving a paper trail. The majority of my money was now safely tucked away in an offshore account, thanks to my broker, who had set up a system for transferring funds when I needed them. I had enough cash hidden in the SUV to last for a while. The nights alone in motels were the toughest. I kept replaying the last week in my mind, the reality of my situation weighing heavily on me. But as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that I was finally taking control of my life. I had been so consumed with executing my plan that I hadn't taken the time to reflect on what had happened to me personally. I had loved Janice, I wouldn't have married her if I hadn't. Thoughts of what if swirled in my mind, but I ultimately concluded there wasn't much I could have done differently. Even if I had known her old boyfriend had returned, I doubted I could have kept them apart. I came to 2 conclusions: she probably never truly loved me, and it was my own fault for being foolish enough to marry her in the first place. On the 5th day away from home, I found myself sitting in a small-town diner in Montana, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the pie was homemade. I pondered what my supposedly loving wife was up to, especially since by now she must have discovered that all her credit cards were canceled and our bank account was empty. My thoughts were interrupted by an older couple at the next table. Their quiet conversation caught my ear. The man, probably in his late 50s, was telling his red-haired wife about his wish for an extra hand on their farm. Unfortunately, he lamented, They couldn't afford to hire anyone until their current calves were ready for market. Even then, finding someone willing to work for the little they could pay proved to be a challenge. As I finished the last bite of my meal, I stood up and approached their table. "I'm sorry to eavesdrop, but I might be able to help you out," I said. The older man scrutinized me, sizing me up. "I don't see how you could do that. If you heard what we were talking about, you know I can't pay you anything. What if I just need a place to stay in exchange for my labor?" I proposed. His eyes narrowed. "Colleen, excuse us for a moment while I talk to this young man outside," he said, standing up. He waited for me to follow him. Once in the parking lot, where our conversation could remain private, he turned to face me. I estimated him to be about my height, 6 feet, with broad shoulders and not an ounce of fat. His once dark hair was mostly gray, and his face bore the rugged lines of years spent working outdoors. "Who the hell are you? Are you part of that Wilson ranch?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. I raised my hands defensively. "Hold on there, mister. I don't know anything about the Wilsons. 4 days ago, I was living in Texas, and I just arrived here this morning. I thought maybe we could help each other out." He studied me closely. "If what you say is true, why would you want to help us?" "I can't afford to pay you. What's in it for you? If you're on the run from the law, we don't need that kind of trouble." "I might be on the run, as you put it, but not in the way you think," I said, deciding to share my story. I explained how Janice had been unfaithful and wanted to take me for everything I had. "I haven't robbed or killed anybody. I'm just trying to keep what's rightfully mine. If you have a place I could stay, I'll repay you with my labor. I'll pay my own way. If you don't think I'm any help, just tell me, and I'll be on my way, no hard feelings." He scrutinized my face for what felt like an eternity. "Son, if what you are telling me is the truth, I think I'd be a fool not to at least give you a shot. But I have to be upfront with you, the Wilsons are trying to get me to sell my land to them. They haven't done anything underhanded yet, but I wouldn't put it past them. You might be biting off more than you can chew." "I understand the risk," I replied. "But it's a risk I'm willing to take." He then inquired about my ranching experience, and I was honest. "I've spent a few summers on my uncle's place in Texas, but I'm not a cowboy." He extended his hand, and we shook on our agreement. "You can call me Bill," he said with a nod. As we walked back into the diner, Colleen was waiting for us, a look of curiosity on her face. "Colleen," Bill called out, "I think we have some help coming our way." Her eyes widened as she looked between us, and I could sense the mix of hope and apprehension in the air. I was ready for a fresh start, and maybe, just maybe, I could find a sense of belonging again. "This is Carson, he's going to be working for us, if he can handle it," Colleen said, standing up and extending her hand. I shook it, feeling her warm grip. "It's very nice to meet you, Carson." Her voice had a clear tone, with a hint of an Irish lilt, reminiscent of her husband. She was trim and fit, exuding a friendly energy that instantly put me at ease. "It's nice to meet you too, Ma," I replied. "The last name is Buckman, but just call me Colleen. No need for formality out here," she added with a smile. I liked her immediately. Bill suggested we head back to the ranch before leaving town. He pulled up to a general store, and we both stepped out of our vehicles. "You might want to pick up some clothes suitable for ranch work," he advised. As we entered the store, the owner greeted Bill warmly, clearly a regular customer. 40 minutes later, I emerged with enough jeans, work shirts, a coat, and a pair of rugged Western riding boots to last me for the week. It was a solid start. From the general store, it was about a 20-minute drive to the main gate, marked by an arch that read Rockingbee Ranch. That was Bill's brand. Another mile down a private road brought us to the main house, a well-maintained 2-story structure with fresh paint. Behind it, I could see a barn and several outbuildings. The pickup they drove was partially loaded with sacks of groceries, a clear sign of their weekly supply run. I parked behind them, filled my arms with bags, and followed the Buckmans into the kitchen. After 2 trips, we had the truck unloaded. "Drive around back," Bill instructed, leading me to a small cabin where I'd be staying. When I pulled around, I saw Bill standing in front of the cabin. He pointed it out and mentioned that Sam used a similar one just a few yards away. "Sam's out making the rounds, you'll meet him later," he added. After unloading my bags, I settled into the cabin. It was a single large room with a bed along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a potbelly wood stove in one corner, and a bathroom with a simple shower. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and served as a suitable place to stay, at least for now, allowing me to avoid being found by Janice. When I stepped outside, Bill was sitting in his pickup. "Hop in, I'll give you a tour of the ranch." We drove over the sprawling 6,000 acres. About 5,000 acres were relatively flat and ideal for grazing, with a couple hundred acres set aside for growing winter feed. The back section of the ranch was hilly, covered in forest, and led to the mountains with a stream running through it, accessible only on horseback. "I used to have 3 full-time hands, but now Sam is the only one left," Bill shared. "Tough times. He's been working on the ranch for nearly 30 years. We hire extra help during roundups for selecting stock to take to market." He dropped me off at the little cabin around 5 o'clock. "By the way, I noticed you carry a laptop. I have a satellite connection with a router, so you can access the internet wirelessly," he mentioned. "Supper is in the main house, and we usually eat at 6 o'clock. As he drove away, I settled into my cabin. In less than 30 minutes, I was unpacked, leaving me time to boot up my computer. Just as Bill said, I was able to connect wirelessly and quickly checked my email. There was one message from Jake, and my heart sank as I read it. Janice had reported me missing to the police, and they were investigating my disappearance. It gave me something to ponder as I sat back in the chair. I never imagined things would spiral this far. Jake was the only one I could trust, but I didn't want him to get caught up in my mess. I needed to stay under the radar for a while longer. The ranch was peaceful, and I hoped to find some clarity out here, away from all the chaos. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a sense of hope. Maybe this was the fresh start I needed. I had made the decision to leave, but even Bill didn't know where I was headed. I had mailed my resignation to my old employer but hadn't faced them in person to announce my departure. As the clock approached 6, I walked over to the main house and knocked on the door. "Come in," Bill called out. I stepped inside and saw Colleen preparing dinner while Bill chatted with a man I assumed was Sam. "Carson, come meet Sam," Bill said with a broad grin. "He's the new hand I mentioned, at least for today. We'll see how he feels about it after a long day of work." "Nice to meet you, Carson," Sam said, extending his hand. He was a big guy, standing at least 6 feet 3 inches, and like Bill, he looked like he had put in his fair share of hard work over the years. He seemed to be around the same age as Bill, and one notable detail stood out: he was African American. I shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. "Well, young man, let's hope you like it here." "I could use the help," he said. At 28, I was about half his age, so he definitely considered me young. "I plan to give it my best shot," I replied just as Colleen called us to the table. Supper was ready. Bill and Colleen sat at opposite ends, with Sam and me filling the spaces between them. The table was laden with a large platter of pork chops, a big bowl of creamy mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and a stack of what were clearly homemade biscuits. "We don't eat fancy here, Carson, but there's plenty, and it's filling," Colleen said. "It looks fantastic," I replied, diving in. As we ate, I asked Bill if he had lived here all his life. "Yep," he said with a hint of pride. "My grandfather started this ranch and passed it on to my father. Now it belongs to me and Colleen. When I was younger, I wasn't so sure she was going to be a part of it. I had to fight off every man to get her, he said, glancing at his wife. I could see the depth of his love for her shining in his eyes. Now, Bill, you know you're the only man I ever had eyes for, Colleen responded playfully. I just had to make sure you wanted me enough. Bill's expression softened as he said, my wife has been responsible for the 3 happiest days of my life, the day she agreed to marry me, the day we tied the knot, and the day our daughter Caitlin was born. I hadn't seen any sign of a daughter, and Colleen must have noticed my curious look. Caitlin is away right now, she explained. She's finishing her doctorate in veterinary sciences at South Dakota State University. She's only been able to come home for the holidays, and we're eagerly waiting for her to return with her degree. She's supposed to be back in a couple of months. It'll be nice to have a vet in the family, Bill added. Should cut down on some of our expenses. After dinner, I tried to help clear the dishes, but Colleen insisted it was her job and shooed me away. Bill mentioned that breakfast would be at 5:30 a.m. and that work would start promptly at 6 o'clock. As Sam and I were leaving, I noticed a copy of today's New York Times on the counter, likely picked up by Bill in town. I asked if I could borrow the front page, and he agreed. Once outside, I invited him into my cabin for a moment. Inside, I pulled out my digital camera and showed him how to use it. I asked him to take a close-up shot of me holding the front page of the newspaper. He seemed curious but didn't ask too many questions. He did inquire about an alarm clock, and I assured him I had one. I'll see you in the morning, he said as he left. Once alone, I downloaded the picture to my computer and drafted an email to the police in my former hometown. The message stated that I was alive and well, having left town of my own free will. By choosing a national newspaper instead of a local one, I kept my location ambiguous, protecting my newfound freedom. I shot off an email to Jake, instructing him to head to one of the local coffee shops with free Wi-Fi. My work email was likely still active, so I provided him my password to forward the original email and the attached photo to the police without leaving any traceable trails. I figured this would help keep me off any FBI or national missing persons lists. After all, the authorities probably wouldn't expend much energy searching for a runaway husband. That night, I slept soundly, the weight of the day slipping away. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., showered, and dressed just in time to walk with Sam to the main house. After a quick breakfast, Bill instructed Sam to put me to work replacing fence posts in a hilly section of the property. Following Sam to the barn, he pointed out the horse and saddle I'd need. Drawing on my experience from my uncle's ranch, I saddled the big brown mare, and Sam seemed pleased with my efforts. We loaded up 2 mules with saddle packs filled with fence posts and a post hole digger. Bill joined us at the barn, carrying a Winchester Model 94 and a saddle scabbard. He explained that the rifle was mostly for rare occasions when we might need to put down a sick cow. With that, we mounted our horses, each leading a mule, and headed out, following the creek up into the hills. As we rode, we chatted and got to know one another. I shared how I ended up in Montana, trusting that Sam would keep my confidence. He opened up too, recounting his own life story. He had married right after high school, only to walk in on his ex-wife in bed with another man. In a fit of rage, he nearly beat the guy to death and ended up serving 5 years in prison. When he got out, Bill was the only one willing to give him a chance, which led him to spend the last 30 years here. Sam spoke highly of Bill and Colleen, calling them the salt of the earth. About half an hour later, we reached the fence marking the property boundaries. Sam pointed out that not all the posts needed replacing, only those that were rotted or close to it. This meant about every third one. He stayed with me while I replaced the first 2 posts, making sure I was doing it right. He suggested we work until around 4 p.m., giving me enough time to care for the horse and mules before dinner at 6. His parting advice was simple: follow the stream back down to avoid getting lost. Once Sam headed back, I focused on my work, progressing down the line and replacing the old posts with new ones. At noon, I took a break and pulled out the pork chop sandwiches that Colleen had packed for me. After finishing my lunch, I returned to the task at hand. My watch's alarm beeped at 4 p.m., signaling the end of my work. I had managed to set all the posts that the mules had carried up, so I began leading them back along the fence line until I spotted the stream. As I descended, I noticed a natural pool where the water flowed in and out. I stopped to admire the view, recognizing it as the most beautiful and serene spot on the ranch. Back at the barn, I unsaddled the animals and managed to get them fed just in time. While I was tending to the horses, Sam came in to bed down his own horse. We rushed to wash up and change before heading to dinner, where we enjoyed juicy steaks. That night, I was exhausted. I made minimal contributions to the conversation, feeling the fatigue weighing on me. After dinner, I excused myself and headed straight to bed. Sleep came quickly, and I sank into a deep slumber. When I woke up the next morning, I was sore all over. My hands ached from wielding the post-hole digger, and my arms, shoulders, and legs throbbed. It was a reminder of the hard work I had put in, but oddly, it felt satisfying too. I knew I was starting to find my place on the ranch, even if my past loomed in the background. My usual gym workouts couldn't compare to a full day of setting fence posts. As I limped into the kitchen, every movement sent jolts of soreness through my legs, making me wince as I sat down. Bill and Sam chuckled at my discomfort, and even Colleen struggled to hide her grin. Despite the aches, I was famished and dug into my breakfast, ready for another day of hard work. "Ready to go, champ?" Bill asked as we rose from the table. I groaned, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. "Yes, sir," I replied, not quite masking my weariness. Bill laughed heartily. "I think you can take it easy today. How about you ride along with Sam?" I nodded appreciatively. Our first task was to clean the stalls and replace the hay. After putting the horses and mules out to pasture and filling their feeder, we loaded into the pickup for our ranch inspection. Our primary goal was to make sure no cows were down or separated from their calves. Sam's knowledge of the ranch was instinctive. He anticipated where the cattle would be and estimated their numbers as we drove. After 30 years of ranching, it seemed to come naturally to him. When we reached the far end of the ranch, Sam suddenly stopped the truck and scanned the hills. Something had caught his attention. He handed me his binoculars and pointed to a specific spot. After a moment, I spotted 2 calves, apparently alone. "Where are their mothers?" I asked. "Over there," he gestured toward a pair of cows near the tree line. "Their mothers must have wandered off into the trees and gotten lost. We'll have to bring them back." "Are we hiking up there?" I asked, a little apprehensive. "Nah, it's too far. We'll head back and grab a couple of horses." Sam picked up the two-way radio and called Bill, updating him on our situation and our plans. When we returned to the barn, Bill had already saddled 2 horses and loaded them into a trailer. We just needed to stock up and hit the road. Sam expertly navigated us toward the tree line where the calves were, and we unloaded the horses, riding up into the hills. Sam's experience was evident once more. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand. About half an hour later, we quietly approached the calves and began herding them back down the hill. I couldn't help but laugh when the young calves spotted their mothers. They bolted toward them, calling out with excitement, and immediately sought out a teat to nurse. The larger cows stood patiently, allowing their young to feed, and I was struck by how different this was from my own childhood. That evening, dinner was a feast: fried chicken, corn on the cob, and mashed potatoes. With newfound energy, I talked more than I had the previous night, eager to learn about Colleen. She shared that her parents had immigrated from Ireland when she was just 5 years old. Her father, fascinated by tales of the Old West, brought the family to Montana, which explained the trace of an Irish brogue in her speech. Even growing up in America, she retained the influence of her parents. The next day, feeling much better, I returned to the fence posts after breakfast. Sam helped me load the mules, but this time I set out on my own. Following the stream led me directly to my destination, and the day proved easier than the first. I had learned some tricks to make the work less strenuous. Just before 4 p.m., I set the last post and headed back to the barn. With some extra time, I worked on cleaning a few stalls before getting ready for dinner. On my fourth day, I assisted Sam with repairs to some of the buildings. The following day, I set even more fence posts. The next 2 months flew by. I took my turn riding the ranch to check on the cattle, and I was in the best shape of my life. We established a routine. Sam took Saturdays off, Bill took Sundays, and Mondays were my days off. It felt good to be part of this tight-knit community, working hard and growing stronger with each passing day. I spent my day doing laundry and making a quick trip into town. I had grown quite fond of everyone on the ranch. Sam was good-natured and easygoing, and we often sat together after supper, swapping stories and laughing. I had a lot of respect for Bill. He was honest and hard-working, and we got along well. Colleen was incredibly sweet to both Sam and me, though I sensed there was a fiery side to her beneath that gentle exterior. Together, she and Bill made a wonderful couple. Breakfast on Friday was filled with excitement. Colleen shared the news that her daughter, Caitlin, would be returning home in just 1 week. It was my turn that day to take a horse and ride through the wooded sections of the ranch, checking for cattle that might have wandered into the hills. Around 4 p.m., I made my way to a stream, following it downstream until I reached a serene pool below a waterfall. I dismounted, took off my shirt, and knelt beside the water, dipping my bandana in to cool my face and neck. As I enjoyed the moment, a rustle from downstream caught my attention. I looked to my right to see a horse and rider approaching. At first, I thought it was Colleen, but I quickly realized this stunning woman was a younger version of her, Caitlin, with the same crystal blue eyes and red hair as her mother. She rode up and stopped several feet away, eyeing me with suspicion. "Who are you and what are you doing on this property?" she demanded, her tone icy. I replied, "The name's Carson, and I work here." She crossed her arms, skeptical. "I don't believe you. My dad said he couldn't afford to pay another hand." Despite her beauty, I felt my irritation rising at her unfriendly demeanor. "Yeah, I heard that too. Guess that's why I laugh all the way to the bank every payday." Caitlin narrowed her eyes at me and kicked her horse, turning it around and galloping away. I chuckled to myself, shook my head, and put my shirt back on before remounting my horse and heading toward the barn. Later, I learned there had been a mix-up between Caitlin and her parents. They thought she was coming home the following week, but she had surprised them by arriving just a few hours after I had ridden out. After spending the morning and early afternoon with her parents, she expressed her desire to ride, something she hadn't had time for while at school, but which she loved. So she saddled up and rode to her favorite spot, the waterfall and pool. Just as I returned to the barn, I saw Caitlin's red hair disappearing inside. I dismounted and left my horse in the stable, assuming she was looking for her father. I could hear her voice ringing through the barn. "Who is that man who was at the waterfall?" Bill paused, thinking. "That must have been Carson," he said. "But he said he works here. Last time I was here, you told me you couldn't afford to pay another hand," she protested. "Well, he's right. He does work here. As for what he gets paid, that's none of your business. I still run this ranch, young lady," Bill replied firmly. Caitlin wasn't done. "But he said you pay him so much that he laughs all the way to the bank." At that moment, I walked into the barn. Caitlin had her back to me, but Bill caught my eye and grinned. "Is that true, Carson? If you think you're overpaid, I can rectify that." Caitlin spun around, and I pulled my hat off, scratching the back of my head. "Well, I'd hate to take advantage of you, Bill. Just how much are you thinking of cutting my wages?" Both Bill and I burst into laughter, while Caitlin continued to glare at us, clearly missing the joke. "Sweetheart," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "just so you know, you're not the only one who can hold their own on this ranch." Her expression softened slightly, but I could see the challenge in her eyes. It seemed like this summer would be anything but dull, especially with Caitlin around. "Bonnet, Carson gets to stay in the cabin next to Sam's," Bill said with a grin. "Really? What else?" Caitlin pressed, curiosity evident in her tone. "Well, that's about it," Bill replied, a twinkle in his eye. "And you're not paying him?" Caitlin challenged. "Why would he work for free?" "He has his reasons, and it's not my place to explain," Bill shot back. I added, "Honestly, working just to enjoy your mother's cooking is worth a lot. I don't think she'd appreciate hearing you say it's nothing." Caitlin shot me a glare before storming out of the barn. Bill shook his head, chuckling. "She reminds me so much of her mother when she was younger." That night at supper, we were joined by Caitlin again. She sat next to Sam, directly across from me, and shot me another sharp look as I entered the kitchen. I decided to break the ice. After everyone had filled their plates, I said in a friendly tone, "Your mother tells me you've finished your doctorate in veterinary medicine." "Yeah," was her curt reply, her eyes focused on her food. I continued, "Sam mentioned there's only one other vet in the area, and he's over 30 miles away. I'm sure you're going to be a huge asset to this community." Caitlin glanced up, her expression softening just a bit. "Yes, that would be Dr. Harrison. He has more business than he can handle and is often needed in more than one place at the same time." Colleen nodded. "I agree, Carson. Caitlin will be a tremendous help around here." Throughout the meal, Caitlin mostly conversed with her parents and Sam, who had been on the ranch long before she was born. She didn't address me directly, and I kept quiet. This was her homecoming, and I knew her family wanted to catch up on her life while she was away. Once I finished eating, I excused myself and headed back to my cabin. After settling in, I checked my email and found a message from Jake. He reported that he had spoken to a friend on the police force, casually asking if they still considered me a missing person. His friend said the case had been dropped after they received the email with the picture I'd sent. As for Janice, Jake wrote that Brandon had dumped her as soon as he found out I'd disappeared with all the money. Now, it seemed she wouldn't be getting her hands on any of it anytime soon. She couldn't afford the rent on the house we'd shared and was living in a cramped city apartment while working as a waitress. Ironically, she'd only married me for my money, and her boyfriend had apparently wanted her for the same reason. I shook my head at the thought, reflecting on how tangled our lives had become. The next morning, I was back to work replacing fence posts, though now I was only doing so every third or fourth day. I'd moved closer to where I could drive the pickup instead of hauling posts on horseback. It was much easier to load them into the truck. After loading the pickup with posts, I drove to my worksite. When lunch rolled around, I realized I hadn't brought my lunch. Normally, if any of us were working away from the main house, Caitlin would make sure we had a meal ready, but I had spaced on picking mine up. I could have driven back to the house, but I figured missing one meal wouldn't kill me. About half an hour later, as I was working, I noticed the sun climbing higher in the sky. The day was turning out to be beautifully warm, and the sounds of nature surrounded me, birds chirping, the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Just then, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned to see Caitlin pulling up in her truck. She hopped out, a lunchbox in hand, and approached me. "Thought you might need this," she said, a hint of a smile breaking through her earlier attitude. "Thanks," I replied, genuinely surprised. "Don't mention it," she shrugged. "Just don't let it happen again. You're on a ranch now, you've got to be prepared." I chuckled, appreciating her spirit. Maybe we could find common ground after all. As I sat down to eat, I realized this unexpected moment was just another step toward making this place feel like home. I had just set a pole and was securing the wire when I heard a vehicle approaching. Glancing back, I recognized it as one of the ranch trucks. It rolled to a stop just as I finished with the post, and to my surprise, Caitlin hopped out, a small sack in her hand, similar to the ones Colleen used for lunches. "Mama said you forgot your lunch," she said, shoving the bag toward me. I reached out and accepted it. "Thank you, Caitlin. That was really kind of you." Opening the bag, I found 2 sandwiches inside. I took one out and offered the other to her, but she shook her head. I shrugged and settled onto the tailgate of the truck to eat. Caitlin walked over and stood next to me, silent and observant. "Why are you here?" she finally asked. I turned to her, considering my response. I decided to tease her a little. "You can't tell anyone I robbed a bank and stashed the cash. I'm hiding out here until the heat dies down," I joked. Her eyes widened for a moment before she shot me a glare. "You're a real clown," she huffed, about to turn away. But as she walked halfway to her truck, I called her name. She paused and slowly turned around. "I married a woman who never loved me, who only wanted what I could provide," I said, my tone more serious. "I ended up here because I just wanted to escape everything I knew, even if just for a while." Caitlin studied me, and I could see her deciding whether I was being genuine. After a moment, she nodded and walked away without another word. As she drove off, I reflected on what her father had told me about her mother being just like her at that age. He had managed to tame her, but I suspected the real secret was their love for one another. It had been less than 24 hours since I first met Caitlin, and I couldn't imagine anyone taming that fiery redhead. That night, dinner was a repeat of the night before. Caitlin chatted animatedly with her parents and Sam. I didn't feel like I belonged. After all, she didn't know me, and we had little in common. We were just finishing up when there was a knock at the door. Bill went to answer it and returned with a man about my age. He fit the mold of what women might call tall, dark, and handsome. "Jason," Caitlin exclaimed, leaping from her seat to hug him. It was clear they were familiar with each other, and they chatted excitedly about how long it had been since they last saw one another. A few minutes later, another knock sounded, and Bill went to answer it again. This time, he returned with another guy, this one fair-haired but equally good-looking. Caitlin greeted him with just as much enthusiasm. I recalled Bill's words about fending off every male around to win his wife. Caitlin was every bit the prize her mother had been, at least in looks. Feeling a bit out of place, I excused myself from the table and headed back to my cabin. Mentally, I wished the 2 guys luck. I couldn't help but envy them. If Caitlin turned out to be anything like her mother, whoever won her heart would be one lucky man. The next day, I took the pickup and rode around the ranch. By the time I had made my rounds, something felt off. It was still early enough that I decided to get Sam, and together we did a whirlwind tour of the property. There were plenty of cattle scattered across the ranch, but Sam agreed that something didn't feel right. "Just a strange vibe, you know?" he said, looking around. "It seems like we're missing something." I nodded, sharing his unease. We decided to investigate further, driven by an instinct that something was amiss on the ranch. We realized we were short a few herds, so we decided to saddle up the next day and ride the hilly areas to search for them. That night at dinner, we discussed our plan with Bill, and he agreed it was a good idea. Unfortunately, it rained that night, which would make tracking the cattle more challenging. The following morning, we loaded our horses into a trailer, and Bill drove us to one end of the property. I rode about a third of the way up into the tree line, while Sam rode another third higher. We then navigated across the ranch, moving over hills and through dense woods. It took a good part of the day to reach the far side, but we managed to count 5 stray herds. Bill met us as we emerged from the hills, and we loaded the horses back into the trailer for the ride home. That night, we discussed the situation over dinner and decided we needed to be more vigilant about watching for any signs of trouble. During the meal, I noticed Caitlin had another suitor come calling. I overheard her mother mutter something about that being the third one that day. Word had clearly spread that Caitlin was back home, and guys were crawling out of the woodwork to get her attention. Over the next 4 days, we spent a lot of time keeping an eye on the herds. Everything seemed fine, except for the original missing cattle. Caitlin's admirers continued to visit her, but she hadn't said 2 words to me since the day she brought me lunch. By the 5th day after the cattle's disappearance, I decided it was time to ride the property line through the hills again. We had already covered all the fence lines along the pasture areas and found no evidence of the missing cattle. Sam dropped me off on the west side of the ranch, where Bill's property bordered the Wilson Ranch. About halfway to the southwest corner, I spotted 3 fresh sets of horse tracks. They crossed from the Wilson side of the fence onto Bill's side, which was puzzling since the fence wire was still intact. I dismounted and checked the posts, noticing that the staples had been loosened on 5 of them, barely holding the wire up. If someone removed the staples and lowered the wire, they could cross over, then put the wire back in place and it would look normal again. I remounted and followed the tracks until I got near the stream. There, I saw 3 horses tied to a tree just above the waterfall. I stayed about 30 yards back, tied my horse to another tree, and pulled my rifle from its scabbard. As I crept closer to the horses, I noticed boot prints leading downstream. I edged to the waterfall and gasped. There was Caitlin, swimming in the pool, completely naked. I was momentarily mesmerized by the sight of her body glistening in the clear water. Just then, movement in the trees to her right snapped me back to reality. I quickly scanned the area and spotted 1 guy to the right and 2 more approaching the pond on the left. I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot near the feet of the man on the right. With another quick pull of the trigger, I shot close to the 2 men on the left. Caitlin let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. Standing up so everyone could see me, I shouted, "Get on your bellies now. I won't miss the next shot." "Caitlin, stay where you are," I called out, aware she couldn't see the 3 men, all she saw was me, rifle in hand. I noticed one of the men on the left flinch as if he might run, but I pulled the trigger again, the bullet striking the tree right next to him. Convincing him to drop flat to the ground, I could see the panic in Caitlin's eyes as she finally spotted the 2 men I was aiming at, causing her to shriek again. In that moment, everything felt heightened, the tension, the danger, and the desperate need to protect her. I was determined to make sure she got out of this alive. I started the countdown, and before I could even say 1, the other 2 dropped to the ground. I quickly instructed them to put their hands behind their heads, and to my surprise, they complied without hesitation. "Caitlin, get out and get dressed," I commanded. She hesitated, clearly frightened, but when I growled at her to obey, she reluctantly made her way out of the pool. As she emerged from the water, it was like witnessing Venus rising from the sea. Even though her back was turned to me, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Her alabaster skin glistened in the sunlight, and the sight of her perfectly rounded backside would be etched in my memory forever. She hurriedly slipped on her jeans and shirt before swinging onto her horse, kicking it into action and disappearing through the trees. Once she was gone, I ordered the 3 men to get up from the dirt and lie back down. Only when all 3 were flat on the ground did I allow myself a sigh of relief. It was time for a bluff. "So, what am I going to do with you 3? I could just shoot you in the legs and watch you bleed out," I said, letting the threat hang in the air. The men started to beg for mercy. "Even if I spare you," I continued, "Caitlin's father will make sure justice is served when I tell him about your intentions toward his daughter. Unless, of course, you have a more compelling confession for the sheriff. Something like cattle rustling? It might lead to jail time, but at least you'd have a chance at life." The smallest of the 3, Wilson, cracked under pressure. "Yeah, we did it," he blurted. Breaking Buckman's fence would secure his land. His partner hissed at him to be quiet, but Wilson wasn't about to back down. "I'm not dying for some damn cows. With Caitlin's swift return and her father's inevitable investigation looming, I decided to buy myself some time. True to my expectations, about 45 minutes later, Bill and Sam galloped into view. I waved them down, and they raced up the rise to join me. "What in the hell is happening?" Bill demanded, scanning the scene. "It seems some of Wilson's hands decided to pay us an unwelcome visit," I explained. "I tracked them from the fence line to here. Caitlin was swimming, and these three were trying to sneak up on her." As I walked over, I pressed the barrel of my rifle against the smaller man's neck. "This one has something he wants to confess to you," I said, prodding him again. He whimpered, "We took some of your cattle, but it was Wilson who forced us." Bill tilted his hat back, a grin spreading across his face. "You know, back when my grandfather ran this ranch, they'd hang horse thieves and cattle rustlers. Justice seemed a lot simpler then. Too bad we have to pretend to be civilized these days." While Sam stood guard, Bill and I decided to march the rustlers back down, rifles at the ready. We trailed behind them, with Sam tying their horses together and bringing up the rear. Upon reaching the barn, we led the rustlers inside, placing them in separate stalls with open doors so we could keep an eye on them without them seeing each other. Bill headed into the house to call the sheriff while Sam and I stood watch. In under 30 minutes, the sheriff raced up the mile-long drive. Bill met him at the entrance, briefing him on the unfolding events. I suggested bringing the smaller culprit out first for the sheriff to interrogate, and he agreed. I promptly brought my prisoner outside. At first, the little rustler hesitated, but as the tension mounted, he reconsidered his silence and began to speak. The sheriff turned to Bill and said, "Looks like we've got a straightforward case of trespassing here." With that, the night was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. It felt like a bit of a waste of my time, but I figured I could hand the situation over to them and forget I'd ever seen it. I let the sheriff handle things, and the frightened rustler's eyes widened in fear. He spilled the beans quickly, and soon the sheriff called for backup. Before long, a convoy of sheriff's vehicles rolled onto Wilson's sprawling ranch. Even with its vast landscape, the sheriff quickly zeroed in on the location the rustler had given him. By the end of the day, they had uncovered nearly 100 stolen cattle branded with the Rockingbee brand. Amidst the chaos, Wilson and his cronies found themselves behind bars. By the time we gathered for supper, it was well past 9. Caitlin sat at the table, her gaze glued to her plate. "What were you doing out there?" Bill asked her, trying to make up for lost time since they hadn't had much chance to talk. "I was just taking a swim. I didn't think anyone would come spying on me," she shot back, casting me an accusatory glare. "First of all, Caitlin, I wasn't spying on you. I followed their horse tracks to the stream. Second, think about what might have happened if I hadn't shown up," I interjected. "Honestly, thank goodness you arrived when you did, Carson," Colleen chimed in. "I hate to think of what those three were planning." The conversation shifted, and we all hurried through dinner, aware of the early start we'd have the next day. As I made my way out of the kitchen toward my cabin, Caitlin called out to me. I paused and turned to face her. "So, did you enjoy the view today?" she snapped, her tone laced with sarcasm. Expecting any gratitude from her was clearly too much to hope for. "Let's just say I'd be lying if I said it wasn't breathtaking," I replied. She huffed and turned away, marching off toward the house. I stood there shaking my head, recognizing that there was something about me that always seemed to catch her interest, whether she liked it or not. The next day, Bill had to head into town to officially file charges against Wilson. He explained that returning the stolen cattle would take several days since the prosecutor needed to thoroughly document everything. Sam and I spent the day refreshing the paint on some of the outbuildings. We had lunch in the kitchen, but Caitlin opted out, which suited me just fine. Bill returned in the early afternoon but chose to save the details for dinner. When he finally shared the updates, he explained that since this wasn't a capital case, Wilson and his partners would be released on bail. While he didn't expect any further trouble, he reminded us to stay vigilant. With a playful grin, he glanced at Caitlin and said, "If you're planning on another nude swim anytime soon, maybe you should take Carson along, for protection." Her face turned crimson, and she jumped up from the table, sputtering as she hurried to her room. Bill, Sam, and even Colleen erupted in laughter, and I chuckled along with them. After the laughter died down, we resumed our meal. Bill continued to tease me, saying, "I really want to thank you, Carson. Wilson could have seriously jeopardized this ranch financially. You're worth every penny." 3 days later, Bill received the news he'd been waiting for: he could finally retrieve his cattle. We loaded 3 horses into a trailer and set out for Wilson's Flying Fly Doll Ranch, accompanied by a sheriff's escort. Colleen came along to drive the truck and trailer back home. Once we unloaded the horses, Bill, Sam, and I began pushing the cows back toward the Rockinby Ranch. As we approached our destination, I rode ahead to loosen part of the fence line, making it easier for the cattle to cross over. After ensuring all of them were on the right side, I felt a sense of accomplishment wash over me. This was more than just cattle, it was about reclaiming what was rightfully ours. And as I looked back at the ranch, I knew I had found a place I could call home, even with Caitlin's fiery attitude thrown into the mix. The cattle were finally back where they belonged, and after securing the fencing, we rode back to the main house, feeling a sense of satisfaction from the day's work. Caitlin had been busy too. She had applied for her veterinary license, knowing it would take around 45 days for approval. For now, she could only care for the animals on her father's ranch. I'd spot her around the property during my chores, and at mealtime, despite her ongoing silent treatment. Whenever I managed to catch her eye, I'd flash a big grin and wiggle my eyebrows, always enough to make her blush. 2 weeks after the waterfall incident, we found ourselves in the barn. "So, have you been enjoying any swims lately?" I asked, leaning against the stall. Caitlin approached, standing just inches away, and shot me a glare. "Why are you such a pain?" I shrugged, grinning. "Why are you such a bee?" Her right hand shot toward my face, but I reacted quickly, grabbing her wrist before she could hit me. Undeterred, she tried with her left hand, but I caught that one too. With a swift motion, I pinned both her hands behind her back, forcing her body against mine. I slowly lowered my face closer to hers, and though she stared defiantly at me, she made no effort to break free. "If you were mine, I'd put you over my knee and spank you," I teased, my voice low. Attempting to pull back, she shot back, "You wouldn't dare." In that moment, I released my grip, and she stumbled backward, landing on her butt. "It's not that I wouldn't dare," I said, my tone serious. "I just got rid of one woman who didn't care about me, and I'm not about to waste my time on another." Traditionally, Caitlin would have stormed off, but this time, it was my turn. I left the barn, leaving her sitting there, flustered. I didn't see her again until supper. As expected, she didn't speak to me, and I couldn't quite decipher the look she gave me, though I never claimed to understand women anyway. My failed marriage to Janice had taught me that lesson. The next day, I was in the barn tending to the stalls when Bill walked in. It was Sunday, his day off, so I figured he wanted to talk. I wondered if Caitlin had told him about our earlier showdown and if he was going to ask me to leave. As he approached, I stopped my work. "I heard you and Caitlin had a little showdown yesterday," he said, a knowing twinkle in his eyes. "Well, that answered my question." "Yeah, you could say that." "Probably my fault," I admitted. Maybe not," he replied thoughtfully. "I think her issue is she doesn't know what to make of you. At first, she thought you were here for something, then you became the hero who saved her and the ranch. What she can't figure out is why you aren't chasing after her like all the other local boys." I nodded, considering his words. Caitlin is used to having boys wrapped around her little finger. She's had a few boyfriends, but none lasted. I don't think she really respected them. Bill continued, I just hope you don't let her chase you off. You're welcome here as long as you want. Thanks, Bill. That means a lot to me. I'll try to quit teasing her, and hopefully, we can find a way to coexist, I said, feeling relieved. After he left the barn, I resumed my work, letting Bill's words linger in my mind. If Caitlin wanted to understand me, being civil and having a conversation would be more effective than our current back and forth. As for chasing her like the others, well, that just wasn't going to happen. That night at supper, Caitlin didn't join us, a topic no one dared to bring up. I didn't inquire about it either. The next day, I stuck to my usual routine, waking up at 5 a.m. even on my day off. After breakfast, I retrieved my laundry. Bill had invested in a large commercial washer and dryer, making it easy to wash all my clothes in one go. The laundry room was right next to the kitchen, so while my clothes washed, I sat at the kitchen table, eating and chatting with Colleen. Just then, Caitlin walked in, a rare occurrence for breakfast, as she usually preferred to eat later. "Morning," she mumbled, her eyes still half asleep. "Good morning. Decided to join us for breakfast?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She shrugged, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Just felt like it." We exchanged a few more words as Colleen prepared breakfast, and for the first time in a while, the tension between us felt a little lighter. Maybe we could work through our differences after all. Colleen asked about my plans for the day, and I mentioned that I was thinking about driving into town. "Is there anything you need me to pick up?" I asked. She smiled and said there were a couple of things she could use, and I assured her it was no trouble at all. Just then, Caitlin piped up, "Can I ride into town with you? I need to go to the general store for a few things, and it seems silly for us to drive separately." I looked up in surprise, not expecting her to want to spend time with me after yesterday. "Sure, I'd be happy to give you a lift," I replied, feeling a mix of excitement and curiosity. "I'll be leaving in about an hour and a half, after I finish my laundry," I added. She nodded, saying she'd be ready. Caitlin then finished preparing something to eat, sitting quietly at the table while Colleen and I continued our conversation. Later, as I stepped out of my cabin, Caitlin emerged from the back door, looking stunning in a turquoise sundress that complemented her fiery red hair. It was clear she wanted me to notice her. Holding the passenger door open for her, I watched as she slid into the seat, and we set off. For the first half of the drive, Caitlin sat quietly, observing the rolling countryside. Suddenly, she broke the silence. "I thought you were going to kiss me yesterday." I glanced at her, surprised, but she seemed focused on the view outside. I chuckled a bit and said, "Well, while that wouldn't have been unpleasant, I have a rule about not forcing unwanted affections on anyone who isn't receptive." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her head snap around, and I could feel her gaze on me. She sat quietly, though I noticed her stealing glances my way. We pulled into the general store, where I needed to grab a couple of new pairs of jeans and shirts. Caitlin had a list of items her mother wanted. An hour later, we had everything loaded up, but I still needed to stop at the hardware store for a few things for Bill. My stomach growled, reminding me it was lunchtime. "How about we grab a bite to eat?" I suggested, and she agreed. We pulled into the same diner where I had first met Bill and Colleen. Taking a table across from each other, we ordered our food. As we sat in silence, I started to regret not heading straight to the hardware store and back to the ranch. Just then, the door swung open, and 3 guys walked in. I recognized 2 of them as the ones who had come calling on Caitlin. They made a beeline for our table, with 2 of them sliding into seats on either side of her while the third loomed behind me. They completely ignored me, diving into conversation with Caitlin. Feeling a surge of irritation, I stood up and gestured for the third guy to take a seat, moving to the next table instead. When the waitress brought our food, I motioned her over and had her place my meal in front of me. I ate quickly, tuning out the chatter at Caitlin's table and tossing some bills onto the table to cover our meals. Caitlin had hardly touched her food, her plate still full. "I'm going to run over to the hardware store. I can swing back by here later and see if you're ready to go," I said, stepping into their conversation. She pushed her plate away, standing up. "It was nice seeing you guys again, but we have to go," she said, her tone firm. The guys protested, with one even offering her a ride home, but she declined and followed me outside to my SUV. As we drove to the hardware store, I could feel the tension simmering in the air. Caitlin remained silent, appearing to fume beside me. The silence stretched as we headed back to the ranch, turning off the highway onto the mile-long driveway. I glanced over at Caitlin, wondering what was going on in her mind. Her earlier enthusiasm had vanished, replaced by a brooding expression. I knew I had to break the ice somehow, but the words seemed to escape me. "Why did you do that?" Caitlin asked, her voice sharp as she gestured toward the other table. "What do you mean?" I replied, uncertain about what she was getting at. "Alette. I thought you preferred hanging out with your friends. Besides, I didn't want to be in the middle of their competition for your attention." "You really are in a hole, aren't you?" she snapped. I stayed silent, not wanting to provoke her any further. As we drove back to the main house, Caitlin grabbed as much as she could carry the moment I opened the rear of the SUV. I picked up more bags and followed her inside. Without a word to her mother, she dumped everything on the kitchen table and then stormed out of the room. Colleen looked at me with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged and said, "I guess I'm in a hole." Colleen giggled and walked over, placing a hand on my arm. "I've never seen anyone have that effect on Caitlin. You must be something special." "More like born to annoy her," I replied, feeling more confused than ever. I returned to my cabin, stowing away my new clothes. Deciding I didn't want to be cooped up, I made my way to the barn, saddled a horse, and rode out to the top of the waterfall. With the weather being so nice, I tied the horse to a tree and sat at the edge, gazing down at the calm pool below. I lost track of time, maybe sitting there for half an hour or more. Suddenly, Caitlin rode up below me, dismounting her horse. Not wanting to risk being accused of spying if she went for a swim, I picked up a stone and tossed it into the water, creating a splash. She looked around, searching for the source of the noise, and when she spotted me, I thought she'd ride off. But instead, she mounted her horse and rode up to where I was sitting. She tied her horse next to mine and walked toward me. I stood up and took a step back from the edge, just in case she was planning on pushing me off. "You're in a hole," she said, stopping just inches from me. "And you're still a bee," I shot back, but this time I didn't wait for her response. I quickly wrapped my arms around her waist and kissed her. The moment our lips met, a spark ignited, and I released her, intending to return to my horse. But she grabbed my arm, pulling me back around. I was utterly flabbergasted when she reached behind my neck and drew me in for another kiss. This time, the passion was undeniable. As we kissed, our clothes seemed to vanish, and we lost ourselves in the moment, enjoying each other's warmth. Gradually, our breathing returned to normal, and we lingered in each other's embrace, savoring the silence. Eventually, we dressed, mounted our horses, and rode back down to the ranch. After stabling our mounts, Caitlin turned and walked to the main house without saying a word. I was left dazed. Later, I returned to my cabin and slipped into the shower. One thing became crystal clear: I had much stronger feelings for Caitlin than I had ever admitted to myself. I barely had time to get dressed for dinner. As I entered the kitchen, I noticed Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already there, but Caitlin was nowhere in sight. Just as we took our seats, she walked in and chose the chair next to mine instead of her usual spot next to Sam. Bill and Colleen exchanged glances, but Caitlin simply smiled sweetly. During dinner, she chatted animatedly, seemingly in high spirits. Her parents looked curious, but they didn't ask why. After dinner, Caitlin helped her mother clean the kitchen while Sam and I headed back to our cabins. Just as I settled into bed, a soft knock echoed on my door. Only in my boxers, I opened it to find Caitlin slipping inside. She found her way into my arms, and we shared a tender kiss before she guided me back to the bed, shedding her clothes along the way. Once again, we made love, our bodies entwined, before drifting off to sleep in each other's embrace. The abrupt arrival of 5 a.m. jolted me awake. Groggily, I reached over to silence the blaring alarm. With great reluctance, I pulled myself out of bed, illuminated the bathroom, and dressed for the day, leaving a gentle kiss on Caitlin's head before slipping out of the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling of scrutiny from Bill and Colleen as I loaded the pickup for another day of setting fence posts. I wondered if they were aware of their daughter's nighttime escapades. Working alone on the ranch offered plenty of time for contemplation, and my thoughts drifted back to my recent past. It was hard to believe that only 3 months had passed since I left my wife. It felt like a lifetime ago. I reflected on the significance of Bill, Colleen, and Sam in my life, but my mind inevitably wandered to Caitlin and the magical moments we shared the previous day. I pondered whether I could find the kind of love her parents had at lunch, a love built on years of shared experiences and deep understanding. Just as I realized I'd forgotten my meal again, I heard a pickup truck approaching at high speed. Caitlin jumped out, rushing toward me with a bag in hand. She threw herself at me, initiating a passionate kiss that left me breathless. After that, she handed me the bag, completely disregarding my forgotten lunch. I pulled her in for another heated kiss, and despite not setting as many fence posts that day, I certainly established a few connections of my own with her. Amid our moments of passion, we also found time to talk. I opened up about my past, sharing the painful details of my ex-wife's betrayal. "The only way I'll leave is if you tell me to go," I reassured her. After our time together, Caitlin eventually returned home, and I finished my work for the day. When I entered the house after my shower, I found her in the kitchen, once again choosing the seat next to mine. Midway through our meal, a knock sounded at the front door. Bill answered and returned with a guy who had previously called on Caitlin. The moment he sat down, Caitlin looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a drive," he suggested. In this part of the country, going for a drive was basically code for going on a date. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think my boyfriend would like it," Caitlin replied, leaning over to plant a kiss on my cheek. The guy, tall, dark, and handsome, blushed and stammered before making a hasty exit. With that, our relationship was officially out in the open. I glanced at Bill and Colleen, noticing their approving smiles. Even Sam couldn't hide his grin. We had become a couple. In the days that followed, there were no more visits from local men trying to win Caitlin's attention. She made it clear she was taken. I found ways to support her plans for her veterinary business. She was seeking a loan from the bank to purchase the necessary equipment, but the bank required her father to put up the ranch as collateral. Caitlin was reluctant to ask him for such a favor. "Give me a couple of days, I might have a solution," I suggested. I reached out to my offshore bank and set up an account under the guise of a fictional loan company. Caitlin filled out a loan application on my computer, which I had set to route to my email. After a couple of days, I sent her a notice that her loan had been approved and a wire transfer would be made to her account. She was thrilled by the news but questioned why the loan carried only a 2% annual rate. They're a nonprofit philanthropic group providing loans to those they believe will contribute to the community, I explained. While I could have simply given her the money, I knew she was too proud to accept it outright. She had worked hard to earn her degree and was determined to succeed on her own terms. By the time her license was approved, she had purchased a new van, transforming it into a mobile vet office complete with all the necessary medical instruments. Once word spread about her license, the calls for her services flooded in, and it felt like our lives were just beginning to intertwine in ways I had only dreamed of. Services often came in from local ranchers, and many nights Caitlin would spend time with me in my cabin. Bill and Colleen were aware of this arrangement but seemed to have no objections. At 27, Caitlin was old enough to make her own decisions, and it was clear she wanted to be there. It took 3 months for Wilson and his crew to face trial, and the case was relatively straightforward. The smallest member of Wilson's crew cooperated with the prosecution, receiving only 2 years of probation, while the 5 others ended up with 5 years each in prison. As the mastermind behind the rustling operation, Wilson received the maximum sentence of 10 years and a hefty $50,000 fine. When he was taken away to serve his time, I decided it was the right moment to initiate an investigation into him and his ranch. What I uncovered surprised me. Wilson was single, with no family in the area, and with all his hands now incarcerated, there was no one left to run the ranch. This revelation sparked an idea in my mind, but before I could set my plan in motion, I needed to wrap up some unfinished business, my divorce. The thought of Janice getting half my money was unbearable. I turned to my friend Jake for help. Instead of sending an email, I called him up and asked him to speak to Janice. I wanted him to convey that I was ready to propose a settlement in exchange for the divorce. The offer was straightforward, $50,000. If she declined, she would never hear from me again and wouldn't receive a dime. At first, she played the innocent card, demanding to know why I had left and why I wouldn't come back. The charade ended when Jake revealed that I was aware of her affair with Brandon and her intentions to divorce me. With her game exposed and still struggling as a waitress, Janice accepted my offer. I needed to return to Texas and engage a lawyer to draft the divorce papers. Caitlin wasn't thrilled when I informed her of my departure. I explained that I needed to close that chapter of my life, reassuring her I would return. Initially, I planned to leave my vehicle in long-term parking at the airport, but she insisted on driving me and being there when I came back. So, I left behind my SUV and most of my belongings, taking only what would fit in one suitcase. I departed on a Sunday, and when I landed, Jake picked me up at the airport. I stayed with him and his family, making sure to call Caitlin every night. By Friday, all the paperwork was sorted. Jake took Janice to my lawyer and explained the terms. She would receive a $10,000 check immediately, with the remaining $40,000 paid in 60 days after the divorce was finalized. She signed the papers and walked away with the check, and I never had to face her again. But then reality hit me. I had personal items in storage, keepsakes, heirlooms from my parents, yearbooks, and other sentimental belongings. Not wanting to leave them behind, I rented a moving van and loaded it up. Caitlin was initially taken aback when I revealed I wasn't flying back, but once I explained I was bringing back everything important to me, her excitement about my return grew. It took me 3 relentless days of driving to cover the distance. When I pulled into the Rockingbee Ranch on Tuesday evening, I was met with an enthusiastic welcome from everyone. That night, Caitlin continued to extend her warm welcome, and we finally fell asleep in the early morning hours, thoroughly exhausted but happy. With the first part of my plan accomplished, I was ready to put the rest into action. This involved making several trips to the prison where Wilson was incarcerated. My goal was to persuade him to sell me his ranch. At first, he was resistant, but I continued to present my case. I pointed out that he would be locked up for at least 7 years, and even with good behavior, he wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. I laid it all out for him. He could either let the ranch fall into disrepair or sell it to me and have some cash to start anew when he got out. I knew I had to play it right. It wasn't just about the land. It was about securing a future for Caitlin and me, and building something of our own. As I spoke to Wilson, I could see the wheels turning in his mind. This was going to be a tough negotiation, but I was ready to fight for what I wanted. The ranch meant more than just a piece of land. It was a chance at a new life, a new beginning. He wouldn't be eligible for parole without someone to tend to his ranch. If he left it unattended, the house and buildings would likely fall into disrepair, and his cattle might perish without proper care through the winter. I also raised the question of whether he would be welcomed back after his conviction. Faced with the grim prospect of losing everything, he eventually accepted my offer, giving him a chance to start over with upon release. Next on my agenda was securing financing. I moved my money back into the country, confident that Janice wouldn't jeopardize her $40,000 by making any rash decisions. I negotiated a price of $5 million with Wilson, which was below the property's true value, making it relatively easy to secure financing. I made a down payment of $500,000 and financed the remaining amount, taking about a month to finalize everything. I kept my plans under wraps, only sharing the details with Caitlin and Bill. I explained that I had personal business related to my assets that needed my attention, even though it only took up 1 or 2 days of my week. I established a corporation and registered the land under its name. With summer fading into fall, I hired someone to harvest hay on the property and employed 4 hands to live on site and manage the ranch in the interim. The most experienced hand was appointed as the temporary foreman. I made it clear that I would be an absentee owner for a while. I assured him that he could always reach me by phone and that I planned to visit the ranch frequently. The final element of my plan involved remodeling the main house, a 2-story, 5-bedroom structure in desperate need of modernization. Despite Caitlin's frustration with my secrecy, our relationship continued to flourish. My love for her deepened every day, and I sensed she felt the same way about me. Meanwhile, her veterinary business was thriving, which often required her to be on the road, but she remained content and happy. There were moments when I almost revealed everything to her, especially after returning from checking on the remodeling. One day, she cornered me with a storm of questions. "What the hell is going on, Carson? Are you seeing someone else?" "God, no. I swear there's no one else," I replied earnestly. "I just have some things I need to take care of. Please believe me, I promise I'll tell you everything soon. I just need you to trust me." She scrutinized my face, searching for the truth. "Okay, Carson, I do trust you. But you better tell me what's going on soon, or I'm going to kick your ass." In that moment, I couldn't help myself. I grabbed her and kissed her passionately, pouring all my love into that one embrace. As spring rolled in and calving season began, the main house renovation was finally complete. It was time to execute the final part of my plan. One afternoon, when I had Caitlin alone, I asked her to go for a drive. "I've been thinking it's time for me to leave the Rocky Bee Ranch," I said cautiously. Instantly, her eyes welled up with tears. But I promised I wouldn't leave. I had timed it perfectly so that we were at the entrance to the old Flying Doll Ranch. I turned in and began driving down the private road. "I'm not really planning on going far," I reassured her. She looked around, clearly confused. "What are we doing on Wilson's land?" I delayed my answer until we pulled up to the main house. "Come on, I want to show you something," I said, getting out of the truck and moving around to open her door. Taking her hand, I led her up to the front door and opened it. "What the hell are you doing? We could get in trouble for this," she exclaimed, panic creeping into her voice. "Relax," I said with a smile. "Wilson doesn't own the ranch anymore. I want to know what you think of the house." Her confusion turned to curiosity as we stepped inside, and I couldn't help but feel that this moment would change everything for us. I took Caitlin upstairs, and as we wandered through the bedrooms, I could feel her excitement bubbling. We made our way back downstairs, where we entered a spacious living room, a beautifully paneled den, and 2 rooms set up as home offices. Finally, we reached the kitchen, and I noticed her eyes light up with delight. This was clearly her favorite part of the house. Only one room was furnished, my planned office, while the rest of the house awaited her personal touch. I turned to her and asked what she thought of the place. "It's really nice," she said, but then she looked puzzled and asked, "What's going on?" I could see confusion clouding her features, so I decided to take a more serious approach. Dropping to one knee, I reached into my jacket pocket. "Wilson no longer owns the ranch." "I do," I said, my heart racing. And I want to know if you would consider living here as my wife. Her eyes widened, and she asked, you own the house? I nodded, a surge of excitement washing over me. Yes. I replied. In a burst of joy, she screamed yes. Back at me. With a smile, I pulled out the engagement ring and held it up, ready to propose. Her expression shifted, and I thought for a moment that I had made a mistake when her eyes filled with tears. But then, she tackled me to the ground, showering my face with kisses. She held out her finger, eager for me to place the ring on it. As she looked around the house with renewed wonder, darting from room to room, I couldn't help but feel a rush of happiness. When she returned to my arms, she exclaimed, "This house is beautiful. I love it." I led her down a hallway to 2 doors. "There are 2 offices, one for you to run your business from and one for me," I said, earning another sweet kiss from her. In my office, I pulled out a large piece of paper. It was a drawing of a property gate with double SC Ranch written across it. She studied it curiously. "What does double C mean?" she asked. "Carson and Caitlin Ranch," I explained. Her face lit up with joy, and she began pulling at my clothes playfully. I joined in, and before I knew it, I had her sitting atop the desk as we celebrated our love right there in the office. In the days that followed, we made love in every room of our new home, filling it with the warmth of our connection. After we regained our composure and dressed, I said it was time to tell her parents. She was so thrilled, she practically floated out to the truck. When we returned just after 6, Bill, Colleen, and Sam were already in the kitchen for dinner. We walked in together, and Caitlin held up her left hand, squealing, "We're getting married." Colleen jumped up, rushing to hug her daughter, while Bill and Sam came over to shake my hand and pat my back. I received a warm hug from my future mother-in-law, while Caitlin embraced her father and Sam. As the excitement settled, we all sat down to eat. Caitlin waited until everyone was enjoying their meals before casually dropping a bombshell. "Of course, this means we'll be moving," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "What?" Bill, Colleen, and Sam exclaimed in unison, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Caitlin looked at me, prompting me to explain. "Well, Bill, you know how Wilson wanted to combine his ranch with yours. I thought it could be a good opportunity," I began, gauging his reaction. Bill stood up, looking furious. "There's no way in hell the Flying D is going to get my ranch." I chuckled, trying to ease the tension. "Calm down, Bill. It's not the Flying D anymore, it's the Double SC Ranch. And the new owners are sitting right at your table." He stared at me, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" "I bought out Wilson. The ranch now belongs to Caitlin and me, Double C, Carson and Caitlin." Colleen's eyes lit up with understanding, while Bill looked more confused than ever. "I thought if we combined the 2 ranches, we could run them together and split the profits 50-50, I explained. "But the Double C Ranch is over twice the size of mine and brings in a lot more profit," Bill argued, his frustration evident. I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was just beginning. "Exactly, but together we could make both ranches thrive. Imagine the potential if we joined forces." As we continued discussing the possibilities, I could see the wheels turning in Bill's mind, and I hoped he would come around to the idea. This was just the start of our new adventure, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead us. "I need your help," I said, meeting Caitlin's gaze. "You've been doing this your whole life. I want us to be equal partners. You'll run the operations, and whatever you say goes. Plus, this is part Caitlin's ranch, too, so it'll keep everything in the family." He paused, looking over at Colleen, who nodded in encouragement. Then he reached across the table, extending his hand. "Danette Carson, this is going to take some getting used to, but I accept your offer." I smiled and shook his hand firmly. "This means we'll have more hands to help, and Sam will be the head foreman. And now, I finally get to pull out all those fence posts I worked so hard to set up on that side of the property." Everyone laughed, the atmosphere light and filled with excitement. That night turned into a loud and boisterous celebration. Caitlin spent the night in my cabin, and let me tell you, she wore me out. We overslept and strolled into breakfast late the next morning. Thankfully, everyone was still in the kitchen, waiting for us so we could eat before heading over to the Double C Ranch for Caitlin to show off our new house. As we arrived, I could see the impressed looks on everyone's faces. Colleen, though, had a hint of jealousy in her eyes as she stared at the refurbished kitchen. It took Caitlin and her mother a month to furnish the house, and it was finally ready for us to move in on our wedding night. Our wedding at the Double C Ranch was something out of a dream. Bill and his family were well respected in the community, and ranchers and their families from miles around came to celebrate. As Caitlin's husband, Bill's son-in-law, and the new owner of the ranch, I felt truly welcomed into their world. Later that night, we finally made it to our bedroom, and let me tell you, we made the most of it. We stayed in bed, wrapped up in each other's arms, making love long into the next day. It was blissful, but on the third day of our marriage, I whisked my bride away to Fiji for a tropical honeymoon. The first roundup of the year went exceptionally well, and we sent a significant number of cattle to market, bringing in a nice profit. A good portion went to pay off loans, but with Caitlin's savvy business sense, we were making a comfortable living. We even built a lovely new house for Sam, and he's now dating a girl closer to his age who lives in town. We might be celebrating another wedding soon. A year has passed, and I have fantastic news: my beautiful wife is pregnant.